Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day. I'll turn my volume down just a little bit for you. Welcome to our weekly wrap up where we discuss the last 7 founders I've published both on founderoftheday.com, my website where I write articles, and here on Founder of the Day, the YouTube channel. As I've mentioned, over the past few weeks, I have started publishing the same founder both in article form and video form on the same day. It's a lot more convenient for me, a little bit more work ahead of time, but that's all right because they're better videos, I feel. If I write the article or republish the article, read it, get it set up to go out, and then immediately record a video about it, I'm so fresh on the subject matter that I can just give you the life pretty well. There is one this week that was a little more difficult than others, a longer video. I had to do a few takes. We will definitely get there. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for liking. Definitely subscribe if you're new here. Anyway, let's start talking about the American Revolution. I am going to go over here. We're going to talk about our first founder today, which of course is never a founder. It's actually an anti-federalist paper, though after the next few months, we'll be discussing the Federal Farmer, an extraordinarily important anti-federalist paper. We'll be discussing them the next few months because we only do one a week, and there's, I think, almost 20 of them. I think it's 18 of them. Worth the read, as we are going to discuss. And after that, I'm actually thinking about going another run of the Federalist Papers. I haven't done them in about a year, and the Federalist Papers are 85 papers. It'll take a year and a half's worth of Fridays, but I think it would be worth it. But let's talk about the Federal Farmer a little bit. Now, this is just an introduction. This one doesn't count. We're not talking about Federal Farmer number 1. We are talking about the observations at large. Now, this is arguably the most important Federalist paper. We discussed Brutus over, not the last month, but before we did Impartial Examiner, before that, we had discussed Brutus for about 4 months, because there's about 18 Brutuses as well, though some of those are in multiple parts. Now, for Federal Farmer, just to get the gist going before we really get into the meat and bones of it, it's 18 essays written against, obviously, ratification of the United States Constitution. Published in New York, really originally published it only in the newspapers in Poughkeepsie, New York, just a city north of New York City. I believe it was a temporary capital for a minute there, but either way, published in New York City, though it really became popular in pamphlet form. And the first 5 were published in 2 pamphlets. Those pamphlets went out, sold really well. So whoever it was, and we're going to talk about that, but whoever it was that wrote the Federal Farmer Papers, or Observations of the Federal Farmer, which is the way we usually call it, whoever wrote it, easy for me to say. Do I say publisher or printer? Either way, same thing. The publisher and or printer decided it would be great to write more because we're selling so many. So he writes more. And these are not as good. Though, as it says here, and of course my laptop is on top of it, this is the abridged Anti-Federalist Papers. It's only most of them. And in this, Herbert Storing, as I said in the video this week, he says it would be unjust to just read the first 5 because although the other ones are a little more wordy and were written really to sell more papers, there is good content and important content to understand about the Anti-Federalist platform in all of the papers. And that is why we are going to, over the ensuing weeks, go through all of them. They started being published in late 1787, and then the additional ones were in 1788. Now, I'm going to say it again because I absolutely love the title of this. The title of Federal Farmer is actually Observations Leading to a Fair Examination of the System of Government Proposed by the Late Convention, and to several essential and necessary alterations in it, in a number of letters from the Federal Farmer to the Republican. And actually, the additional letters, as I said, the later pamphlets, have an even longer name, but I'm not even gonna try. So the question is, when we're discussing the Federal Farmer, is who the heck was the Federal Farmer? Because, well, I could tell you the Federalist Papers were James Madison and Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. Most of the Anti-Federalist Papers we really still don't know. federal farmer, unfortunately, is no different. Now, for a long time, and by a long time, I mean about 230, 240 years, we thought it was Richard Henry Lee. And the reason for this is some gentleman in New England wrote to a friend that he thought it was Richard Henry Lee. Now, that he was taken at his word for hundreds of years, and no one really thought too much about it. But both Murray Dry, a historian of Anti-Federalists, and Gordon Wood, another historian of the American Revolution, in the 1970s, both about the same time, independent of each other, came to the conclusion that this doesn't sound like Richard Henry Lee. First of all, Richard Henry Lee made arguments publicly at the ratification convention in Virginia and beforehand, and his arguments are not nearly as... he just makes different arguments than the federal farmer. They make all the Anti-Federalists, of course, overlap in their arguments, but they just focused and concentrated on different themes. Additionally, it just doesn't really sound much like Richard Henry Lee in the way it's written and the way it's presented to itself. And therefore, these gentlemen really came to the conclusion that it wasn't... Oh, additionally, Richard Henry Lee actually wrote to a friend in the North. The friend he wrote to is eluding me right now. I apologize for that. But he did write to a friend and said, hey, can you send me the Federal Farmer? Because Richard Henry Lee had heard about it and wanted to read it. Why would he want a copy of it if he knew? I mean, I guess you could say he's trying to cover his tracks, but that's a long way to go to cover your tracks trying to be anonymous. Again, I'll repeat that the reason they were anonymous and wanted to be anonymous is this is a time and period where character and the person you are really reflected on your position in society and whether or not people would believe you or not. So people could write articles, and if it was, for example, Richard Henry Lee was a very important leader in Virginia, people would look at that and say, well, it's Richard Henry Lee, we should probably take him seriously. Or they'd say, it's Richard Henry Lee, now we need to value his opinion less. Therefore, they wrote anonymously because they wanted the weight of the argument, the actual political and economic theory, the governmental theory itself, to stand above and be what people were considering. So, that's why we don't know who it is. Now, there have been many, many analyses of this, if that is the plural of analysis, analysi, and the conclusion that generally is come to, and again, we're not sure, but it certainly seems to be that Melancton Smith of New York is the one who wrote these papers, because it is published in New York, where he was a lawyer. It covers a lot of the same themes he would later really cover when he went. Smith goes to the ratification convention in New York State, and a lot of what he says on the floor of that convention are very, very similar to what he says or what is said in the Federal Farmer. And furthermore, the Federal Farmer kind of reflects his writing style to a large degree. So right now we're thinking it's Melancton Smith. Interestingly enough, even though he is one of the leaders of Anti-Federalists in New York, he's one of the reasons the Federalist Papers were written. Madison and Hamilton really looked at Melancton Smith and his buddy Governor Clinton, Robert Yates and John Lansing, who had walked out of the Constitutional Convention. This little entourage of, I shouldn't even say little, this gigantic entourage of leaders of New York State were a thorn in the Federalist side. And therefore, Melancton Smith goes to the convention, speaks against it, really tries to get the New York to not ratify the Constitution, which at this point, New Hampshire ratifies and becomes the 9th state, and the U.S. Constitution goes into effect just days before the vote that New York takes. But still, they are fighting against it. But when word arrives that New Hampshire has voted against New Hampshire has ratified the Constitution, and it is going to be a government. There are now 9 states in this new government that will take effect the following year. Smith is one of many people who kind of throws his hands up and says, okay, well, New York can't fight the United States. You know, and I don't mean physically fight it, but like outcompete it. Although, if they had known what New York City would become, maybe they would have thought differently. But Melancton Smith actually turns around, despite all of his hard work, probably writing all of these Federalist Farmers papers, and votes for ratification of the Constitution, so long as they can attempt to amend it. So that's Melancton Smith, who probably wrote the Federal Farmer. Again, this is just an introduction. Over the next several weeks, we will be going through every Friday the Federal Farmer. So tomorrow, look forward to tomorrow's video. Will be the founder of the day will be the Federal Farmer. So number one, observation number one. Let's move right along. Anyone sign in? Thank you so much for coming. Let's talk about some more Revolutionary War. I have a hair in my eye, which is not ideal. I apologize for that. Of course, if you guys have any questions, there's not a whole lot of us hanging out today. That's okay. It's nice out ahead. I understand that. But if you have any questions, feel free to let me know, either right now or later on in comments on the social medias, wherever you'd like to chit-chat with me, I can be found. I'm going to take a sip of my water. It's hot and flannel in the summertime. Anyhoozle. 2 sick signers. This is a picture of Thomas Lynch Jr., not a picture of Thomas Lynch Sr. We are going to talk about both of them. I want to make a quick note. Something I learned just a few months ago, actually. Still got the hair in my eye. Something I learned a few months ago. The titles Junior and Senior would change pretty frequently. Anytime someone had a kid and named it after themselves, which happened pretty frequently, and still does, they would suddenly become Junior and Senior. But then if there's a third, sometimes the third would go by the third. But once Grandpa passes away, then Junior would change his title to Senior, and the third would go by Junior. Fun fact. Anyhoozle. Let's continue. So 2 sick signers. So the Declaration of Independence is signed in 1776. And in Philadelphia that day, representing South Carolina, are 2 Thomas Lynches. Kind of. So, before we talk about Tommy Lynch Jr., let's talk about his dad, Thomas Lynch Sr. Thomas Lynch Sr. was a leader of South Carolina in the Colonial Assembly, and he ends up he becomes angry at the government pretty early on. South Carolina is pretty good about getting angry at what Great Britain's doing. A lot of the hostilities seem to be in the north. A lot of the southern colonies are a little bit slower to take up the cause, except South Carolina jumps in pretty hot and heavy. Thomas Lynch Sr. actually goes to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City in 1765, whining and complaining about the Stamp Act. Of course, as we know, grievances are sent to England, and the Stamp Act is rescinded. Works pretty well. 9 years later, the First Continental Congress is called together because, hey, they're doing it again over there in Parliament. Thomas Lynch Sr. goes, he signs the Articles of Association, aka the Continental Association, which was the outcome of the First Continental Congress. Thomas Lynch Sr. is then sent back to the Second Continental Congress. Now, we're going to pause here with Thomas Lynch Sr. and talk about his son. Well, a lot of this is going on with Thomas Lynch Sr. Jr. goes to England to get his education. He becomes a lawyer and comes back and almost immediately joins the Patriot cause because his dad's already doing it, and a lot of his buddies in South Carolina are doing it, so he jumps in too. He very quickly is he's elected to the Provincial Congress, which is the shadow government that pops up after the royal governor dissolves the Colonial Assembly. After that, he becomes a commander of a company in the 1st South Carolina Regiment. So, regiment is usually about 1,000 people that he is leading to Charleston, ready to fight. And then he falls ill with a fever. Now, I do not know what this fever is. It is hard to determine because it's so long ago. We're not entirely sure, but he finds a fever he can't shake. He goes home to recuperate and cannot lead his soldiers, but he feels better and wants to go back, but he can't. He is sent to Philadelphia. Why is he sent to Philadelphia? Well, sadly, his father, Senior, who's serving in the Second Continental Congress, had a stroke. So Thomas Lynch Jr. is added to the delegation to go replace his father, essentially, not technically replace him, to join him, but really take his seat because his dad had a stroke and can't make it. Also, he's going there to take care of his dad, who had a stroke. So he goes there, and he's there for a few months when the vote on independence happens. And he's there a month later when the Declaration of Independence is signed. Now, sadly, Thomas Lynch Sr. is still in Philadelphia and still a delegate to the Second Continental Congress, but he is too ill to make the trip a few blocks to sign the Declaration of Independence. And it's real sad it's real sad that was the situation, because had he made the trip, Thomas Lynch Jr. and Thomas Lynch Sr. would have been the only father-son tandem to sign the Declaration of Independence. Granted, if he didn't have a stroke, Jr. probably would have never been sent to the Continental Congress in the first place, but we're having fun here. Now, I'm having fun right now. It gets a little sad. I almost forgot, I should note, time out. Before Jr. shows up to the Second Continental Congress, Thomas Lynch Sr., before he has a stroke, joins Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Harrison on a trip to Massachusetts in 1775, not long after George Washington took over the army. And they go there to meet with George Washington, discuss this makeshift army he's inherited, discuss the other soldiers coming from the South to join this essentially New England army, and talk about how they could come together, what they could do to help. And the major result of this is Washington's Navy, as it's colloquially, as its layman's terms called. The Washington's Navy is essentially a few ships of private merchant ships that are rented and fitted out to be privateers in the army, because they could harass the British ships around the Navy, around the port of Boston a little bit during the siege of Boston, and therefore just take a little bit of heat off Washington, when he would eventually, like 9 months later, finally get cannons from Ticonderoga, thanks Henry Knox, throw them up on Dorchester Heights, and shoot them down at the, not shoot them down at the British, but use them to have the British evacuate Boston. A thrilling victory. Now, moving back forward just 1 year, because it's between this time and the signing the Declaration of Independence a year later, that Lynch Sr. has his stroke. Again, Lynch Sr. is in Philadelphia but can't make it to the signing. Lynch Jr. does sign, and then in December of 1776, father and son leave Philadelphia, and they leave the Continental Congress, and Lynch Jr. wants to take his father home to South Carolina. Unfortunately, on their trip, they stop in Baltimore for the night, and Lynch Sr. has another stroke and passes away. Lynch Jr. there kind of falls out of the public eye. He is now, his father's passed away, he has taken over the family, and he is still sick with the fever he had caught when he first was marching troops across South Carolina. Therefore, he is given medical advice that was very common back then. We know it to be very silly now, but it was common then. I guess I shouldn't say silly, because, you know, in many ways, if you think healthy, you can be healthy. So, but the advice was, go to the Caribbean, and that'll heal you. And that very infrequently worked. There's a laundry list of founders who were sent to the Caribbean to get that good old air to make them better, and it didn't work. Thomas Lynch doesn't get that air. He goes on a ship to the Caribbean with his wife, and the ship is lost at sea. And he vanishes, and his remains, presumably, are at the bottom of the ocean. When he died, he was just 30 years old, and every single signer of the Declaration of Independence, he was not the first signer to die. That was Button Gwinnett, less than a year after the Declaration was signed. I don't mean to laugh, but he's got a silly story. Thomas Lynch was only 30 years old when he dies, which means he's the youngest person he's the I don't know how to say it right. Of all the signers of the Declaration of Independence, he had the shortest life span. I'm trying to make it a fun fact, even though it's really morbid. Thank you for watching, guys. Thank you for coming. Let's see. Who's our next? Who's on deck? All right, William Henry Drayton. I'm going to sip my water real quick. Excuse me. Guess it's stuffy in my room. I always end up sniffing a little bit once I get into it. William Henry Drayton, absorbing Georgia into South Carolina, Oh, what fun. Annexation. What a fun topic. So, William Henry Drayton is actually really slow to take up the Patriot cause. In fact, when the Stamp Act Congress happens, we were speaking before, he is also from South Carolina. He is closer to Lynch Jr.'s age than Lynch Sr., but when Lynch Sr. goes over to the Stamp Act Congress, William Henry Drayton is a very young man who only recently came of age and started being a lawyer. And he published a paper about how terrible it was that people were going to the Stamp Act Congress. He talked a ton of trash about the Stamp Act Congress, saying, hey, your king said go to the Stamp Act Congress. You know, your king gave you the Stamp Act. You should like the Stamp Act. Deal with the Stamp Act. And, you know, not all the patriots loved this, but you know who did love it? The royal governor. Because he got appointments on the governor's council. He got appointments to the colonial Supreme Court in his mid-20s because he wrote this great paper supporting the king. And, you know, that they wanted to reward that. The British weren't all bad, I suppose. However, after the intolerable acts are passed, William Henry Drayton changes his mind. He does not really care for the idea that Massachusetts has been shut down. And like I said, he's in South Carolina, which is probably the most radical of all the southern states. So he ends up supporting the Continental Congress. At this point, nearing 30 years old, he writes another paper, a pamphlet titled American Claim to Rights. And this paper was really supportive of the Patriots, let's just put it like that. So supportive that not the different royal governor, but suddenly he was dismissed from all these positions the royal governor had given him for being such a good old subject of king. And, well, off he goes. He's no longer involved. But he does join the Patriots, and once the provincial government is created, he, along with Thomas Lynch Jr., joined this provincial shadow government that took over for the king. He joins the shadow government and helps to create the new constitution for South Carolina, especially after independence is created. And he is chosen to be the first Chief Justice of South Carolina's Supreme Court. A pretty radical change for a guy who did not like the Stamp Act just a decade earlier. He also works with his friend Arthur Middleton, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, to design the Great Seal of South Carolina, which I believe it's changed over the centuries, but more or less still stands today. Eventually, he's sent to the Continental Congress, and he spends, about, I believe it was 2 years in the Continental Congress. Doesn't do a whole lot, doesn't sign anything fun, but he then goes to Georgia. You see, South Carolina was looking down at Georgia and saying, hey, Georgia, there's only like 20, 30,000 of you down there, which is about the same size as Philadelphia, but you're a lot bigger than Philadelphia. You know, you guys can get invaded pretty easily. Also, you don't have a lot of money down there. You don't have a lot of much of anything down there in Georgia. Hey, Georgia, why don't you become part of South Carolina? We have money in South Carolina. We're not as big as you are, but we got money here. We got people. We know what's going on. South Carolina is super cool, Georgia. Don't you want to be part of South Carolina? And the now state assembly in South Carolina votes unanimously to annex Georgia and make it part of South Carolina. And they choose William Henry Drayton to go down to Georgia and tell them the good news. Thing is, I just sold you guys on how great South Carolina is. I just did a great job convincing Georgia to become part of South Carolina. But in the real history, well, they had this vote without even talking to Georgia about it. And then they sent William Henry Drayton down, who spoke in front of Georgia's state assembly and said, guess what, guys? We've decided to annex you. Come on down. What do you mean? What do you mean you don't want to be annexed? You don't want to be annexed either. Wait, none of you. None of you want to be part of South Carolina? This is crazy. South Carolina is so much better than Georgia. Come be part of South Carolina. Suffice to say, Georgia would have none of it, and they told him to get lost. And he did for a while. And then he came back and started trying to talk to state assembly persons separately to convince them to go on the floor and motion to be annexed into South Carolina. Now, they had already unanimously rejected this idea. No one in Georgia, no one, not one Georgian, not one, wanted to be part of South Carolina. To the point where Georgia Governor John Adam Treutlen issued a warrant for Drayton's arrest. They said, if you find Drayton, arrest him so we can deport him, or worse, or imprison him, because he is undermining Georgia. I want to remind you, I almost used the word treason. I almost wanted to say Georgia considered him committing treason, but they didn't, because treason is when you do something against your own country. And at this point in time, under the Articles of Confederation, a South Carolinian did not belong to the same country as Georgia. Georgia was its own country. All the different colonies, now states, consider themselves states, like nation states, like nations, like different countries. So Drayton was actually viewed more like a foreign, I don't know what the word, like a spy, almost like committing espionage, trying to throw a coup over the government. Now, Drayton doesn't get arrested. He runs away back to, where else? Good old South Carolina. And I want to make clear, I'm not making fun of South Carolina at all in this discussion. I'm making fun of William Henry Drayton and South Carolina's attitude here. Shouldn't make too much fun of Drayton, because he goes back to South Carolina and actually catches typhoid, and then passes away very quickly and untimely at just the age of 37, which is a 37-year-old myself, as kind of a bummer. I will admit it. What is not a bummer is this story. I think this is just one of the most hilarious little whoopsie-doos in the American Revolution. Let me know what you think. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to carry right on to our next founder. Who's that? Oh, yeah, John Adam Treutlen. If that name sounds familiar, it's because I literally just said it. This is the guy who issued an arrest warrant for William Henry Drayton. Now, what you might see next to me is a little bit of a murder mystery. Yeah, we're going to get there. But what's more important, the actual title of my article is John Adam Treutlen, From Indentured Servant to Governor. Because he's one of the few gentlemen to work his way up, pull himself up by his bootstraps way further than life and society would have anticipated him pulled up. You see, John Adam Treutlen came to Georgia with his parents just a little bit after Georgia was founded. Georgia was only founded in 1735, making it the youngest colony and only 40 years old at the time of the Revolution. And he came over as one of the original settlers of Georgia. Though he was only 10 years old at the time, he, like his parents, were indentured servants and expected to work until they paid off their fare for passing over the Atlantic. Now, fortunately for Treutlen, there was a pastor in his town of Ebenezer named Martin Bolzius, is probably how it's pronounced, I would presume. Martin Bolzius comes over and notices that this young man, this child, is exceptional, and he helps pay for him to go to the only school around, a local school that had recently been built, and he is brought there and given a really good, a fairly good education, but because he was already a brilliant young man, he was able to excel from his position. By his mid-30s, he establishes a successful merchant business and a plantation. I do want to note, he did own slaves on the plantation. That's what he did on plantations. And while I don't believe his main trade was slaves, he definitely did trade in slaves. And I want to make note of that. But also, he was selected a justice of the peace for his little community, making him really the most important person. There were just little legal disputes between his neighbors, but he was the guy who settled and resolved issues between neighbors. A really important position at the time. Still technically is a really important position, local judgeships. But at the time, it was being a local judge in your county for most places in the future United States was a really respectable, important position. And even if you weren't mayor making the rules, you were the one determining who was right and who was wrong. Anyway, this former indentured servant goes on to become commissioner and surveyor of roads for Georgia. This is, again, a really, really, really important position. I'll remind you, George Washington made his name as a surveyor. There was land out there to be had But we had to figure out what land it was before we could divide it up. And being commissioner and surveyor of roads meant he not only had to figure out the land, but he actually had to decide where the roads would go between the land so that we could then divide up the land. Really important and fairly lucrative position. Additionally, eventually, he's sent to the Georgia House of Commons. He made it. He is now a politician officially. When things get a little getting with the Great Britain, he becomes a radical immediately. He associates with the Radical Party. Georgia politics gets really complicated real quick. As I said, there's not a lot of people in Georgia. Most Georgians remain loyalists. And of the maybe 1/3, maybe 2/5 of Georgians who decide to jump in with the Patriots, there is a great divide between Georgians during the American Revolution, even the radicals, because there's like the revolutionaries who are conservative and want to kind of keep things the way they were, and then there's the radicals who like really want to mess stuff up. And John Adam Treutlen is one of these people. So is Button Gwinnett, who signs the Constitution, and then another gentleman, George Wells, who I've looked into on several occasions. It's pretty hard to find information about this guy, George Wells, although these three people really ran the Radical Party of Georgian politics. In fact, at one point, there's actually 2 revolutionary governments, which is surprising it didn't end violently, although I will say Button Gwinnett does die in a duel, so it does end violently for some people. Actually, it does end violently. Treutlen eventually, once that shakes out, Treutlen is elected as the first governor in the history of Georgia. A little surprising his name isn't really well known, but there are a lot of governors. It's no big deal. Anyway, he's governor for about 1.5 years, and then he leaves the position and goes back to family life. You see, the pastor in his town of Ebenezer passes away, and as a leader of that town, since they don't have a pastor, they look for him for not only political guidance but spiritual guidance. And then, so he leaves. This radical who had done so much to push Georgia towards independence, to push Georgia into a more radical constitution, to take over as the first governor of Georgia, just kind of leaves and goes back to take care of his own. He does this for about 4 years, and then things smooth out. New pastor comes to town, everything settled down. He jumps back into politics, and he's elected back to the Georgia Assembly. And then he is murdered. Now, there are extremely weird questions about his murder. Considering he was a governor of Georgia, we should know a little bit more. I've even seen people question if he was killed in Georgia or in South Carolina. Now, probably killed in Georgia. That I can say. He was definitely killed by mob violence. Now, I'm going to tell you the story as it's generally told. Although, again, there are questions about this story that no one has the answer to. But the story goes that 4 or 5 gentlemen showed up at his house, said, "Come outside." He said, "No." And they lit his house on fire. So he and his wife and children had to escape the house, at which point they beat him to death. Now, maybe they just wanted to beat him up. Maybe they didn't mean to kill him. Don't know. Did he die? Yeah. Real dead. Unfortunately, he does pass away. Now, we have no idea what was going on with this mob. Did he do something personal to someone and they were seeking revenge? Maybe. There is a chance that people did not want this former radical who made a lot of enemies in the highest levels of elite Georgia. Despite becoming governor, it was close, and there were not people who were happy with him. So was he taken out by his political enemies? Maybe. Was he taken out by some South Carolinians who were not happy that he got rid of William Henry Drayton, as we discussed before? Also possible. The most likely scenario seems to be that his death in 1782 came after the victory at Yorktown, about 6 months later. but more than a year before the Treaty of Paris it was actually ratified. And as I said earlier, Georgia was a heavily loyalist state. Not only was it loyalist, but Britain had come through, and the loyalists in Georgia felt vindicated and safe that Cornwallis had stormed through. Sadly for them, Cornwallis then lost the war, and they were not happy. Now, I am speculating here, but from what I've read, it really seems to me that the people who killed him were probably loyalist neighbors who were extraordinarily upset that the war was won by the Patriots and blamed Treutlen because they would very soon be losing their property and probably have to leave. So that is my estimation as to the mystery of the murder of John Adam Treutlen. Hope you liked it. Hit like, subscribe. I know, a few of you, the handful of you watching, already like and subscribe. That's why you're here. All right. Oh, man, we're at 36 minutes. Perfect time. All right, Pierce Butler. I am sorry to talk about Pierce Butler. So, I had written about Pierce Butler a few years ago. I've realized, rereading this and publishing another article on Pierce Butler, I probably don't talk about slavery as much as I should. As I said in the video this week, which, like, I know was a little all over the place. Usually, like, I do the videos in one take. I write the article, I edit it, I publish it. You know, I've set it up to publish a day or two later. And then I've hit record and shoot a video about it. And that's it. And I usually get it right the first time because I just read it. I have it fresh in my mind. Pierce Butler, I shot that video a bunch of times. I definitely don't talk about slavery as much as I should. Not only because, as an historian talking about the time period, or I should say a student of history, no PhD, not a historian, as a student of history of talking about this period of time, it is just essential to the time period. And I should talk about that as just a part of the economy. I never leave it out on purpose. I generally go and look for stories. And since I'm focusing on an individual, I don't often talk about a greater institution in the society unless it's directly affected by that individual. So, to be fair, I should. When I talk about a slave owner, I should note how many slaves they own, because it is important, not just for the society at the time, but to note where they stood in society and to note where they stood on that particular peculiar institution, as they called it. And looking back at Pierce Butler, I realized that I did a great injustice when I first wrote about him because I really didn't talk about it. I talked a little bit about slavery, and I did put a link to a book about his ancestors in slavery, but I don't talk about it enough. And I'm not trying to make excuses. I certainly don't want to ignore it, and I certainly don't want to apologize for it. I mean, dude, slavery's terrible. It still is, and it's still a problem. A real problem in the world right now, actually. But we don't talk about modern politics here. That being said, let's talk about Pierce Butler. So Pierce Butler fought in the British Army, and he is part of the wave of British officers who were sick of dealing with Great Britain, resigned their commission after the 7 Years' War, and moved to North America. Butler's one of these guys. Moves to North America, one of the few that moves to South Carolina, but he is able to establish a little bit of a merchant firm and a large plantation. And very quickly, he takes the wealth he had when he arrived in North America and turns his plantation into one of the largest in South Carolina, arguably one of the largest in North America. Again, growing tons of products, not tons of products, growing several products of which he grows tons of, and by he, I mean his laborers, of course. He tries to stay out of the war at first because he just wants to be rich and hang out. But he does realize that he needs to lump his... He does realize he wants to side with the Patriots, and eventually he does. Governor John Rutledge asked him very specifically for a favor to help with his military experience, of which he had decades, to help take over. He actually helps to organize the defenses of Charleston, and a little bit he wants to help protect Georgia from the invasion of the South. Now, Georgia's already being invaded once Butler comes to hang out. He tries to help organize the resistance in Charleston, which gets seized, which he gets there's a siege and then it is seized. Anyway, Butler helps to set up the defenses of Charleston, but then he's the what we would call the designated survivor, and he is sent out of Charleston in case it's taken, so that someone can run the show. And Charleston is taken, and Butler's one of the handful of people who does run the show, and he does oversee the defenses of South Carolina into North Carolina and Virginia, and he gets really involved in that campaign, trying to prevent Cornwallis from making his way up to Virginia. Now, thank you, Nathaniel Greene and Francis Marion. They're the ones who really do the heavy lifting on that and push the British back and win the war. Sorry, George Washington. Nathaniel Greene is probably the most underrated soldier of the American Revolution. But anyway, Pierce Butler, he is involved with the resistance, and then the war ends. The Patriots win. Yay! And Butler goes back to his home, which is destroyed by the British. And he has to actually rebuild a second plantation. Again, don't love plantations, don't love what was going on there, but it's really interesting that he is able to rebuild an entire plantation and go back to being one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina after his whole place is burned down, destroyed. Because of this, he's a very important person in South Carolina, and they send him to the Constitutional Convention. He goes to the Constitutional Convention, and he participates and then actually signs the United States Constitution. He then gets elected by South Carolina to the United States Senate. He is an inaugural member of the United States Senate, which means he is one of the original handful of dudes. When there were 13 states with 2 senators, the United States Senate only had 26 people in it. He's one of these 26 people. Really interesting place. So he's initially a Federalist. He did help write the Constitution, so, he likes the government. But pretty quickly, he switches his affiliation to the anti-administration party because he does not like the amount of power being assumed by the federal government. Doesn't really care for some of Hamilton's machinations, I think is the word he probably would have used. But he also has a lot of disagreements with the anti-administrations because he likes the idea of a federal government. He likes a strong central government. He just doesn't want it too strong. He actually declares himself independent of both parties. He makes a very strong note of telling everyone, I am no longer with either party, which is a very Washingtonian thing to do. And then he retires after a little bit from there. He retires from politics. Interesting side story is Aaron Burr, after he duels Alexander Hamilton, goes on the run, finds himself in South Carolina, and actually spends some time at Pierce Butler's house while he's hiding out before returning to D.C. Okay, I said he retired from state politics. Butler does occasionally off and on serve in the state assembly, but that's really just because he's super wealthy and had not a lot else to do, but really enjoyed a quiet retirement. Now, when it comes to Butler, I was speaking about slavery before, and I skipped over what he did at the Constitutional Convention. Now, obviously slavery, I'm rolling up my sleeves for it, obviously slavery at the Constitutional Convention was a great debate. Slavery is very interesting during the American Revolution. It's not what it becomes by the time of the Civil War. Slavery at the time, when they wrote the Constitution, was viewed as a dying institution. They thought it was getting too expensive. It just didn't have the profit it could be. Like just a pure economic standpoint, which I know is a crappy way to look at human lives, but that, this is how they looked at it. And just by that pure standpoint, they thought it was dying out. They did not know that within a decade, Eli Whitney would invent the cotton gin and totally change the game. They had no idea that was coming. That being said, there were a lot of questions about how do you liberate people? Like, again, the American Revolution is the peak of the Enlightenment. The founders knew they were committing, not all of them, of course, I never want to just generalize thousands of people, but most of the people, especially at the Constitutional Convention, knew that slavery contradicted what they were going for. some of them didn't care. And Pierce Butler is one of those people who didn't care and did his best not to even acknowledge that it was contradictory to what they were going for. Because again, I shouldn't even generalize the Constitutional Convention. No, not even everyone at the Constitutional Convention thought slavery was that wrong. Many thought it was a natural way that life should operate. But of course, ideas were changing. It's one of the beautiful things of the American Revolution, especially the Declaration of Independence, is things are changing, and we can make changes for the better. Butler didn't want to make those changes. So Butler made the argument that he pushed very hard for slaves to be counted as full people, not citizens, people, because he wanted South Carolina to have the most amount of representation in the new government as it possibly could. And what's a good way to do that? We'll have slaves count as people, because if you count slaves as property, which is how they viewed them, most people at the time viewed enslaved persons as property. But people in the North, Gouverneur Morris, for example, was saying, well, why can't we count our property? I own a lot of houses. My house has to be worth more than one enslaved person, right? But if you count enslaved persons as people, then you get more representation. The argument comes up, though, are they people or are they property? Because if they're people, you gotta let them go. And that is where we end up with the 3/5 clause. And Pierce Butler is one of the people who argued very strongly to count them as fully people to get more representation. Again, the 3/5 clause is a compromise that comes about. Is it a shitty compromise? Yeah, it is. And I'm sorry for cursing, but there's really no way to better say it. That it's just an awful compromise. But they were trying to start this government. I'm not apologizing for it. I'm just acknowledging this is what happened. That being said, Butler also makes a proposal that turns into Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 of the United States Constitution. This becomes known as the Fugitive Slave Clause. Now, I am not a legal expert in any fashion. No matter how many times I read the Constitution, it doesn't mean I'm good at it. That being said, Pierce Butler came and presented an article that he wanted included, which at first was, it's your responsibility, it's the responsibility of other citizens of other states to capture and escape slaves and bring them back to their owners. Now, if this sounds familiar, that is what happens in the 1850s under the Fugitive Slave Act. And that is one of the major reasons that lead to civil war. But the Fugitive Slave Clause, it was a little much for people at the time. Now, what actually gets in there is it is up to the states to permit people to retrieve their enslaved persons who have run away. There it is. As opposed to putting the onus on the individual states, the federal government can help individuals go into those states and get their slaves. That, of course, has been now essentially eliminated from the Constitution with the 13th Amendment, because now you can't have slaves, so it's, that article has literally no effect. Unfortunately, again, I don't feel bad slandering Pierce Butler like this. He did, in his day, have, many important contributions to the American founding. But that is his most lasting contribution to the American founding, is the Fugitive Slave Clause. And it's a blemish on the United States government and a blemish on American history. Again, we want to be objective and we don't want to come down too hard on people. He was doing what was best for his constituents, which I know is a cop-out, but is theoretically what you're supposed to do in a representative government. It is and I'm not, again, he was one of the largest slave owners. In fact, his real legacy is his grandson. Oh, someone left. I'm sorry you guys get to. His grandson, Pierce Meigs Butler, ends up inheriting all of his slaves. And in 1859, after running up a lot of gambling debt, Pierce Meigs Butler has a sale of the slaves to pay off his gambling debts. And he has the largest slave auction in American history. It's called the Great Slave Auction, where 436 men, women, and children were auctioned off. And it is also called by the many of the enslaved people who suffered from this the weeping time. It's not a very often discussed part of American history. It is just 2 years before the Civil War, which probably was the best time to sell off your enslaved persons, sadly. But it is important to draw our attention to. And when it comes to the Butler family in America, that should be what they're remembered for, not that Pierce signed the Constitution. So, sorry to bum you out. As I was saying before, I don't talk about slavery as much as I should have. It's a bummer. And I like to be happy and talk about fun things. I mean, even, someone getting martyred in the Revolutionary War, yeah, they die. Like, Dr. Joseph Warren's story is a bummer at the end, but it's a fun bummer for us to reflect on as students of American history, as opposed to slavery. So I'm going to try and make note more. My promise to you is to try and make more note of how slavery was involved in individual founders' lives than I have before. Because even when I have spoken about slavery, I've usually talked about slaves fighting in the war, or slaves getting liberated, or enslaved people and their relationship with masters who have grown as people and learned how to liberate, the more uplifting stories. They are fewer and further between. Another thing that's real difficult is that most enslaved people, their lives were just not kept track of in a fashion that, we would have liked to see. The American Revolution is very well documented. It's really well documented. Except for, and even for women and children who were keeping diaries. Surprisingly, we know a lot about a lot of the women, who were participating in the American Revolution, but not enslaved people. So I'm sorry. Ashley, hi, thank you for a question. Since there was the idea that slavery might die out after the Revolution among some founders, was there any talk of abolition? Well, yeah, it depends where you were. So, the Constitution was written in 1787. That is 8 years after Pennsylvania abolishes slavery. Because the people of Pennsylvania, many of them, not only Quakers, it was a Quaker colony, but there were lots of people in Philadelphia of a variety of backgrounds. Also, many German Mennonites came over, like my ancestors, who Mennonites are also generally anti-slavery in that fashion. Methodism was taking off, so suddenly, just about this time, you have, I believe his name is Richard Allen. I might be confusing with another gentleman, but there are several preachers who are of African descent who are getting liberated from slavery and taking up Methodism, which is a movement. Furthermore, again, Constitution 1787, the Massachusetts Constitution, the second one that's finally ratified, is written in 1780. And a few years after that, you have Elizabeth Freeman and the Freeman suit, where Theodore Sedgwick helps run her suit. And eventually, that makes its way up to the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, where William Cushing, who we've discussed in the past, he acknowledges that the Constitution that had already been written a few years beforehand for the state of Massachusetts, that Constitution, which had already been written, it does say free and independent, or free and equal. So yeah, actually, Massachusetts accidentally has already eliminated slavery. New Hampshire never outlawed slavery. It just kind of goes away. I've talked about the Whipple family and how they liberated their slaves and permitted them, like Prince Whipple, to petition the government of New Hampshire for to eliminate slavery. They kind of put that aside because they're busy, fighting the Revolutionary War, and everyone forgets about it. And then, even though it's never outlawed, by the time of the Civil War, New Hampshire just doesn't have slaves. New York, you have the New York Manumission Society pops up right about this time. I'm not entirely sure the date it was founded, but right about this time, the New York Manumission Society is created. Yeah, so they are talking about it. I mean, you have George Washington just 12 years later emancipates his slaves. Yes, upon his own death, actually upon the death of his wife, but Martha doesn't want to sit in a house with lots of people waiting for her to die, and she ends up emancipating most of them while they're alive. I will say they don't use the term abolition. That term comes up a little bit later. They generally use the term manumission, which means the same thing. But, since we're studying the topic. Yes, so people were doing this. In fact, in the original, now, Thomas Jefferson is a tough character, especially when it comes to slavery. But it should be noted, when he wrote the original copy of the Declaration of Independence that he submitted to the Second Continental Congress, they vote for independence on July 2nd. Independence Day should be July 2nd. And then they spend 2 days reviewing the Declaration itself, and they edit out 1/4 of the original document. And I really recommend you read it, because there's some interesting things they cut out, like when Jefferson blamed the King of England for the institution of slavery. He blames the King of England for sending slaves over to North America and subjecting them to the lives that they're living. Now, is it the King of England's fault? No. If anyone, it's Portugal's fault. They had been shipping slaves around a lot. And let's say, not fun fact, the most slaves were actually brought from Africa to Brazil, which still speaks Portuguese, wink wink. So and Spain had been bringing them over for a long time, so it wasn't strict. Probably why they edited out of the Declaration, the original draft, is because it's a real stretch to try and say that King George III, who had only been king for 20 years, had created this institution 150 years earlier. But yeah, like, they knew. Actually, they knew that it was wrong. Almost to a man. I mean, Pierce Butler, probably in his heart of hearts, knew it was wrong. Especially because by this time, you have people taking biblical arguments. It would be Benjamin Franklin, the last thing he does before he dies, about like a year and a half after the Constitutional Convention, is he writes from the Pennsylvania I don't remember the title of the society. I don't know if abolition is in the title, but he's the president of the society trying to end slavery in America. He writes a letter to Congress saying, outlaw slavery. That's like they show up to start the U.S. government, and there's a letter from Ben Franklin saying, get rid of slavery. What are you doing here? Like I said, I always like to say this is the peak of the Enlightenment. So this is when, people have really reasoned things out, and they've really figured out, they're talking about right and wrong. They're trying to fight for their rights. And one of the interesting things from my perspective is, we think of the Declaration of Independence saying these are the rights we have. No, those were rights they were supposed to have and didn't. And from my perspective, one of the things about being an American, one of the ideals is, when America was founded, they didn't have the rights that they claimed were natural and inherent. And they had to fight for them. And by they, I mean rich white dudes. And poor white dudes. And eventually, 30 years into the United States history, you have white dudes that don't own land getting some voting rights. And then you slowly have poorer and poorer people. And then eventually, and I know it's easier said than done, but you have black people start getting voting rights. Black men at first, of course, and then women are fighting for suffrage. And it takes forever. And even though black people in America were liberated during the Civil War, of course, Jim Crow, it takes another century. And in many fashions, there can be argued that there are still places where voting is suppressed in a variety of fashions. Voter suppression is, again, I'm not talking about modern politics. I don't like talking about modern politics, but it's always been a sneaky thing. So it's always hard to detect. Furthermore, we probably have not achieved the goals written in the Declaration of Independence. We may never do it, but the whole point is that as Americans, we are supposed to drive ourselves towards that. And I know if I sound like I've gotten a little off from, were there any abolitionists there? Yes. First of all, absolutely. I mean, you got Thomas Paine running around writing the craziest shit for the time. I mean, you got him writing about like redistributing wealth and things like that. And it's different levels. So like, you know, it's one of the interesting things. Again, I don't love talking about modern politics, but it's one of the interesting things when I hear people, when they talk about slavery using like Washington and Robert E. Lee in the same breath. Although Robert E. Lee did marry Washington's granddaughter, wink, wink, but they were, and I shouldn't even say Lee because he's a weird character, and I'm this is not about the Civil War, but slavery at the time was just they called it the necessary evil. That's how they referred to it. They never even called it, not never, but very rarely in discussions did they call it slavery. The wealthy elite, they called it the necessary evil. And like, I frame it like this, is like, I know not everyone watching this probably believes in climate change, and that's fine, but let's just assume we do for a second here. Assume you believe in climate change. Do you drive a car? Is it an electric vehicle? Well, if not, this is an inherent problem. It's industrialized. It's in the system. So how do we remove ourselves from this necessary evil? It's a long, slow train, unfortunately. That's why most of the founders pursued gradual emancipation. Like New York, I know New York best because I live in New York. I believe you do too. New York fights for a while and then eventually outlaws slavery in 1799. But slaves weren't just freed. Any slave born starting in 1799, because that's how chattel slavery worked, is you were born into slavery. You didn't become enslaved, you were born enslaved. So any mother that had a baby, any slave mother that had a baby after 1799 in New York State, that baby was free. The mom wasn't free. The baby was free. And then anyone who lived until 1727, I believe was the year. 1827. So 28 years after the law went into effect, all slaves in New York were freed. And the thinking behind this was that to take someone who had been enslaved for their whole life and just say, okay, bye, figure it out, is not really great. It's not fair to that person to just cast them aside. Not that being enslaved was fair in the first place, but to just throw them out like that does not improve their station. And that was the goal of the New York Manumission Society and the anti-slavery law in New York State in 1799. The goal was to get people out of bondage and onto their feet. And in a republic, the people are supposed to have a certain amount of knowledge. This is what they believed back then, and could be argued today that if you are ignorant of the operation of a free society, then that could be the downfall of a free society. And the goal was to teach these enslaved people how to teach their children how to be free people in the United States. And again, it sounds on its face cruel to not just to manumit them outright like they would do during, well, like kind of like the Emancipation Proclamation did. But again, that was a wartime thing. Well, again, there were plenty of good Civil War channels if you want to learn about that. But that was the point of gradual emancipation. I will note, Abraham Lincoln, when he wanted to emancipate the slaves when he was running for office, wanted gradual emancipation because it, in a large degree, worked in New York. Now, it was never perfect in New York or anywhere else. When the Civil War comes, there are riots against black communities because the draft comes along and people of New York City don't want to go fight in a war for black people who live elsewhere. Not my idea, super racist. I'm not cool with it, but that is the thinking of the day. But this generally seems to have worked and helped people get on their feet and start communities. So yeah, I hope that answers your question, Ashley. We still got 2 founders to go, and we're already over an hour. But thank you so much. I could probably talk about it quite some more time. I need to drink water either way. But thank you for asking, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation. Because, again, I feel bad that I have not spoken enough about it. It's not my area of expertise, and I'm nervous about getting things wrong, certainly. I am confident about everything I just said, but, getting into specifics on lives, I've been reaching out to people for interviews. I'm hoping to find someone to come talk to us a little bit about it. I have a lot of questions. I could make a video generally about being enslaved. I mean, let me know. Leave me a comment if you'd like me to take a crack at that. I could. I know enough about it. Like, I've done the research. I have books on it. It's a bummer, and it's being covered elsewhere. And also, like, this sounds stupid. I'm on YouTube. I should want people to watch. I should do, like, clickbaity things. But because slavery is such a hot topic to be, like, woke about right now, it turns me off to a focus of discussion, because no matter what I say, this is a long live video, and there's just a few people who are going to ever watch this, and that's fine. I'm really happy that you guys come. It's really an honor for me to share this with you. But making a video on it, it's just like courting those randos on the internet who just stir up trouble for no reason. Truthfully, getting called out for being not woke would make my channel extraordinarily popular, and I'd probably be able to make this my career. But it's not really how I want to go about it. But thank you again for asking, Ashley. I really appreciate it. Let's move on to something not such a bummer. How's that sound? How about Philemon Dickinson? Great name, man. Philemon. I think Philemon. So when I say the name Dickinson, and we talk about the American Revolution, there's probably a name that comes to mind, and it's John Dickinson. And that's for good reason. John Dickinson is one of the most important people in the American Revolution. Super underrated, super underappreciated, but really, really important. Wrote the Pennsylvania Farmer, against many of the poor decisions of Great Britain in the late 1760s, making him a little bit of a celebrity. As Dr. Jane Calvert has come on several occasions to talk about Dickinson, as you know, and he is important. He goes on to write just the Olive Branch Petition, the letters to the king, the Articles of Confederation. He doesn't sign the Declaration of Independence, which is, as I was saying before, like, your character, where you stood in society, was very important, and his level of society plummeted for a little bit there. Then he goes on to be governor of Delaware and Pennsylvania at the same time. Blah, blah, blah. I'm glad I could help, Ashley. I really am. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic. I don't know. Maybe I will. We've already moved on from it, but I like to talk about it. It's very... Of course, each individual founder's thoughts on slavery was complex, and each had different ideas about how to handle it. Like I was saying, I'll follow with one last thing. We talk about gradual emancipation, but by the time James Monroe becomes president, who also is a founder, he's an inaugural member of the United States Senate. He beat James Madison for the first Virginia Senate seat. He fought in the Revolutionary War. He was part of the Jefferson and Madison administrations. He made the Louisiana Purchase for President Jefferson. Like, James Monroe, when he becomes president, has serious credentials when he gets there. And he is a member of the American Colonization Society, because the fear in much of the South, in the North, liberating slaves was a little bit easier because there were so many more white people. In the South, there were so many more black people that they were afraid that even if they didn't liberate the slaves, that there would be revolts. But they were really afraid of I forget the terminology they used, but essentially a race war would break out. So the idea was, well, how do we liberate them without keeping them here? And there were thoughts to make like black person states, which they also had the same thoughts for Native Americans. In fact, Indiana for a little bit was supposed to be Native American state, and Oklahoma essentially was until the 1900s. And the idea, they were thinking, well, maybe we give black people their own state, and then they can be cool, and we'll be cool, and that'll be cool. But the prevailing thought was, well, how about we start a colony? Because all the powerful nations start colonies, and now that we got this constitution and we're a strong federal government, let's build an empire. Let's start a colony in Africa of black people. That way they're back in Africa, and we have a colony. Which, on the face of it, seems to make sense, except by this point, most of the black people, their like great-grandparents had, not most of them, but much of the black population of the South, their like great-grandparents were born in America. So they're like fifth-generation Americans. They're more Americans than I am. And my ancestors came over a long time ago. So they underestimated how much black people would want to go there. But they did start Liberia. Actually, the capital of Liberia is called Monrovia. Right now, in the world today, the capital of Liberia in Africa is called Monrovia, named after President James Monroe. It's one of the only capitals of another country to be named after an American president. Anyway, so that doesn't work out great because many of the Africans who went there, many of the formerly enslaved Americans who went to Africa actually come back because they hate it there, because it's just, they don't, you would think colonists were good at being colonizers, but they weren't. It's like the difference, really, the Americans weren't really colonists. By this point, they were colonials, because the Americans didn't, even the white people didn't come to America and start it, they were born here. So, all right, I've gotten off topic again. Anyway, thanks, Ashley. Maybe I will make a video. Philemon Dickinson. So Philemon Dickinson is the younger brother of John Dickinson. And John Dickinson is wildly famous for a variety of reasons. Philemon not so much, though he should be. Because he's a little slow to respond to the call for independence. But once the fighting breaks out at Lexington and Concord, Philemon Dickinson joins the militia in New Jersey, where he lives. He joins the militia. He's originally elected as a colonel, and he goes to help. Within just a few years, he ascends to Major General of the New Jersey Militia and spends much of the war as the highest ranking military officer in the New Jersey Militia. And I'll remind you that militias were essentially their own army. The state militia was the state's army. And the Revolutionary War had the Continental Army, sure, and then 13 other armies from all the different states, although Georgia's was kind of crappy, and had Vermont, had the Green Mountain Boys, which is, again, not really an army. There's not enough people for that, but close. Oh, Rhode Island also actually had an army of Rhode Island. Rhode Island's the only colony that had its own army beforehand. The army was smaller than the militia, but it was still there. So he's leading an army of people. He is most noteworthy for, Jersey has the most battles of the American Revolution, believe it or not, and most of these are skirmishes. Most of them are during the Forage Wars, where they're fighting over the no man's land around New York City for food. They're just raiding farmers. The British and the Americans are just raiding farms and stealing all the food. And Philemon Dickinson is really good at that and helps feed both the New Jersey militia and to a large degree the Continental Army through that work. What is his probably most famous event is during the Conway Cabal, which was a bunch of dudes tried to get George Washington ousted from Commander-in-Chief for Horatio Gates. It does not go well, and the Thomas Conway, who the Cabal is named after, actually gets challenged to a duel by John Cadwalader, and John Cadwalader shoots him in the face, and he stands over his body and said, "I shot that damn rascal in the mouth." And damn rascal is like the worst thing you can call someone back in the day. And where Philemon Dickinson comes in is he was his friend John Cadwalader's second, which at this point most of us know what a second is from, Hamilton, the play. He was the number 2. Philly Dick over here was, I should probably not have used that abbreviation. I guess I should think about the nicknames I give these guys before I blurt them out. Philly D over here was the backup plan. He was the second to John Cadwalader, so he had to negotiate how the duel would be played out beforehand. He then goes, he served the entire war, then he goes to the Continental Congress to represent New Jersey for 2 years, which at that point under the Articles of Confederation we usually call the Confederation Congress, but he didn't go, New Jersey didn't send him, Delaware sent him. That's right. That's right. So Delaware's a weird thing during the Revolution. It is usually referred to as the lower counties, the three lower counties, because it shared a government with Pennsylvania. Now, I don't want you to confuse that with them being the same government. For a time, New Jersey and New York shared a government. This would happen from time to time. It is a little strange that the shared government carried over for a time after the Revolutionary War, or during the Revolutionary War. But he lives in New Jersey. He runs the New Jersey militia. The war ends, and living in New Jersey, Delaware asks him to go to Philadelphia for him. This is because he owns so much property in Delaware, and your citizenship, your residency of a different state, a young state, was not based on where you lived. It was based on how much property you owned in that state, and he owned a lot in Delaware. So while his brother was both governor of Delaware and Pennsylvania, he was a New Jersey resident representing Delaware in the Continental Congress. Not much really. He doesn't really contribute much there. In fact, it's during the time where people just aren't showing up. That leads to the need for a constitution. He then when he goes back to New Jersey, where he's from, he joins the state assembly. He's there for several years. He actually serves as vice president of the Senate in New Jersey for a few years. And then eventually William Paterson is elected governor of New Jersey. And this is important because William Paterson, when he's elected governor, is serving in the United States Senate, which has just been created. And Philemon Dickinson is chosen to go and replace him. And he serves for 5 years in the United States Senate during the George Washington administration. That's Philemon Dickinson. We're running way over, so I'm just going to pop right on over to Ebenezer Hazard, EBH over here. Ebenezer Hazard is also a lot of fun. We got a lot of fun guys this week. Let's see. Give me some water because I'm thirsty. So the Revolutionary War breaks out, and Ebenezer Hazard is running a print shop in Philadelphia. And he closes it down because he was asked to take over as postmaster of Philadelphia. What a guy. Well, that's great news. The next year, he's actually asked by the Continental Congress to take over as Surveyor General of the Continental Post Office. So Surveyor General of the Continental Post Office. It's kind of a position. General sounds like it's in the Army, but it's like Surgeon General today, where it's really like a cabinet position. But this is really important because he's Surveyor General of the Post Office. So it's his job to determine the roads, the best roads that would be taken to communicate for the Continental Congress. I know what you're thinking. Well, didn't Ben Franklin already create a post office? Yeah, he did, but there was a war going on, and you couldn't necessarily just take the same old roads. Sometimes you had to find new routes, and Ebenezer Hazard was in charge of finding these alternate routes. He does a pretty good job. And in 1782, not long after Yorktown, he is actually chosen as Postmaster General under the Articles of Confederation, the Confederation Congress. And he serves until 1790. He serves 8 years, almost all of the 1780s, which would indicate he did a very good job. And from my perspective, he does. But he does a few things that irk the wrong people. And by the wrong people, I mean one person, and that person is George Washington. He irks George Washington. First of all, he changes in the North, they were using stagecoaches to deliver mail, which could carry a lot of stuff at once, but move fairly slowly and cost a lot to upkeep. And he changed that to single riders with a bag or some satchels, which would carry less at a time, but you only have one horse instead of 2 or more horses and a whole carriage to upkeep. And additionally, you could travel faster and you could have more stopping points. So he did this to make things go a little bit smoother. And that's not really what gets to George Washington. The other thing Hazard does is he says, hey, let me back up. At the time, newspaper printers would print a newspaper, and then they would mail it to the other printers around the continent because it was important information. Hopefully, these other printers would also print it. And there was a long-standing tradition in Great England, Britain, that printers could send papers to other printers for free. It was seen as important for passing on necessary information for the general public. And Ebenezer Hazard in 1788 says, I think we're going to start charging these people. I mean, they're making a lot of money. Why don't we just charge them for their postage? We charge everyone else for all their postage. Why don't we be fair about it and charge the printers for their postage? Now, as I said, this was 1788, and you might recall that in 1788 there was a great deal of debate about ratifying the Constitution during this time, and George Washington got real mad because, well, not only anti-federalists but federalists need to be able to get their pro new Constitution information out to the public, and this looked like the elite trying to suppress access to information. Now, this probably was not Hazard's idea because Hazard himself was a Federalist. He wanted the new Constitution to be ratified. In fact, it was ratified, and Hazard wanted to be the first postmaster. Now, he's the first acting postmaster because when Washington shows up, he kind of takes in the people who are already in their positions. There was no cabinet necessarily for the under the Articles of Confederation, but there were ministers. There was Minister of Finance, Minister of the Navy, Minister of Foreign Affairs, not minister, secretary. I'm sorry, secretary. Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Jay, Secretary of War, Henry Knox, and there was a Postmaster General, Ebenezer Hazard, and Hazard takes over as the acting position. He wants to keep the position, but that person who's in charge now, George Washington, who gets to choose his cabinet, he's not really pumped with some of the things you'd been doing recently, Ebenezer, and unfortunately, he is cast aside for Samuel Osgood, who goes on to be the first Postmaster General, and his decisions are fine. Now, Ebenezer Hazard at this point had been working in public life for almost 20 years. I'll say 15 years. And he's a little nervous about going into private life. He does, though. He actually ends up creating the Insurance Company of North America. Now, insurance companies at the time are not what we think of insurance companies today, except the Insurance Company of North America. Ebenezer and the other investors and founders of the Insurance Company of North America essentially create the modern insurance company, where not only it was like, okay, there was one company that insured boats, one company that did fire insurance, one company that did property insurance. Ebenezer Hazard and the Insurance Company of North America did all of the insurancing. And it was the first time it was wrapped up like this. And I like to put it like this. Ebenezer Hazard was the first person to insure both the house and the things inside of it. And that's Ebenezer Hazard. And that's a long video. We are about 23 minutes over what we usually do because I was chat-shitting about slavery for a little bit there. Thank you guys so much for coming and listening. I will not be doing a wrap-up next week. I will be out of town. I will not have trivia tomorrow or next week because I will be out of town. I'm really sorry, guys. I will be back the following Thursday to do trivia. I'm probably going to do a double-decker trivia. Not trivia, I'm sorry. The following 2 Thursdays from now, I will be back to do a wrap-up. It'll probably be a double-decker. I'll probably do 14 founders because I'm missing a week. And let's have some fun. Let's talk for a while. And I'm not exactly sure how trivia will go the following Friday because we'll have missed 2 trivias, and it is July 2nd, which is what should have been Independence Day, the day they actually voted for independence and the nation became independent. So we're going to do something fun that day. I have some ideas. We'll probably play a little trivia, and we'll probably do a few other fun things. So look forward to that. I'll announce it on the social medias and on the Discord when it's coming up. Again, you guys have any questions? Ashley, thank you so much for your questions. That's why we ran long, but it was worth it. It's, like I said, slavery is a really important subject to talk about, and I've never meant to ignore it. I've never meant to, I certainly never apologize for it. I never try and sweep by it, but I probably don't talk about it enough. So again, I am going to really try and note at least which founders owned slaves and how long, how many enslaved persons were in their care, for lack of a better term. That's it. Thank you guys for coming. What day is it? It is Round Bottom Day. Okay. Thank you guys for watching this extra long video. I really appreciate it. Again, sorry, no trivia tomorrow, but I will still be putting out my daily videos. And I have already recorded, I am a few interviews ahead, and we have some awesome chats coming up. Dr. Stravinsky came back to talk about George Washington's second, what she calls the B team, his second round of cabinet members, and it's a great conversation. So definitely look forward to that coming up next week. Thank you so much, guys. I'll be out and round bottom.